and we'll get started. Let's start with Mr. Russell. You are seeking a fifth term, I believe.
Yes.
I'm sorry? Okay. Scott Russell is the Republican running for re-election, and Greg Doroski is his Democratic challenger. You are running for a fifth term.
Yes.
Tell us, and the voters here, why you feel and what you've accomplished that you should be returned for that fifth term.
Sure. Let me just step back for a second and let you all know that, just so you know a little bit about where I came from. I actually graduated Mattituck High School in 1982. At the time, the president of the school board had handed me my diploma was Councilman Bill Rowland. Now, if you told me that day that someday I would come back and be supervisor of Southold Town, I would not have believed you, because I was 18 and I couldn't wait to leave. I moved, went to college in Washington, D.C. I worked on Capitol Hill for 2 years. I went to New York, worked for a law firm. I lived in Manhattan for a year and a half. And you know what? I got to be around 25, and I thought to myself, I can't wait to get home. I came back, sought office. I was an assessor. Many of you probably remember, for 15 years before I ran for my first election in 2005. I've spent a lot of years dedicating myself to making this a better community, or to contributing to this great community. Whether it was serving as president of a local civic association for 3 terms, whether it was serving as a trustee to the library for 3 terms and 1 term as president, I've tried to give back. As a public official, I've went to work every day trying to produce the best results I can on behalf of all the taxpayers of Southold Town. Now, one thing you've heard a lot, and you've heard a lot recently, is that we can do better. I'm going to agree, we can. We can always do better. Every day I go to work, I try to be a better supervisor than I was the day before. I try to learn from my mistakes. I try to expand or build on my successes. But I'm not a finished product. None of us are. We always strive for more. And the commitment I'm making to you is that I'll continue to bring that work ethic. Now, that work ethic, the results so far, we have a town budget that is probably one of the most fiscally sound on all of Long Island. We've been recognized by the Wall Street bond rating agencies for our strong fiscal management. We've protected over 16 acres of open space, development rights, and recreational areas. Don't forget, some of this is also for public enjoyment, like the golf course in East Marion that we recently purchased. We've led the charge on green energy efficiency, the promotion of green energy. We were recognized for our proactive approach at promoting green energy. Those aren't my words. Those are the words of NYSERDA, the state's leading agency that promotes green energy. I've been proud to have been endorsed by the League of Conservation Voters and the Long Island Environmental Voters Forum, 2 of the leading environmental organizations on Long Island. I've been pleased and honored to have their endorsement because they've recognized our commitment to the environment. Now, affordable housing. We've made several changes to the code over the past few years to promote affordable housing, not only in the hamlet centers, but in the halo zones, which in and around the areas, not just in the village centers. We've created a legislation that allows for people to have, as a principal use, up to 6 apartments here, 6 apartments there, to try to scatter. But at the same time, we need to recognize that if we limit ourselves, we need housing so badly, as every speaker before us told. Yes, we need it badly. But then they say, but it's supposed to be limited to the hamlet center. We can't. We proposed accessory apartment legislation. We eased restrictions on earlier legislation that had been on the books since the 1980s to make getting an accessory apartment within your home easier. We've eliminated all the bureaucratic snafus that go along with it. We did that for 2 reasons. First, we needed the accessory apartment for part of the inventory. Secondly, for many people who are seniors, it was an opportunity for them to carve off some of the house that they no longer needed to generate income for themselves and so that they could stay. We revisited that. We made it easier. We created for the first time accessory apartments that would be allowed in separate accessory structures. The caveat being, if you're going to do that, though, You had to reserve it for use of someone who could qualify for the Affordable Housing Registry, or you had to use it for or you would be allowed to use it for a family member. The idea is that when your kids are coming home for college, you can give them a place to live on their own in the back, not in the basement, which is where I lived for a couple of years. I was a BA major, so I'll have to live in the basement for 2 or 3 years. But you know what? The fact of the matter is we've recognized that. We've tried to address that issue. Now, the fact of the matter is that we do have challenges. We've made new changes to the code. Some of those changes do need the support of Suffolk County Department of Health. We engage with the Department of Health on a monthly, no less than once a month, 2 or 3 times a month, to try to help us move the ball in the right direction. They are listening. They are currently amending some aspects of the county code. As soon as they do that, as soon as we utilize more of our sanitary flow bank, which I think Jill Doherty explained before, we buy preservation here. The right to build houses we've removed. We've taken what would have been potential sanitary flow and we move it here, which is into the ambulance centers. All right, so that we've loosened the rules on that. We've redefined that. So we're doing all we can to promote the affordable housing in those ambulance centers. We're getting there. We're on the 1 yard line with the Suffolk County Department of Health. On top of that, the affordable housing fund that Mr. Hanlon spoke about before. He said, well, you have all this money and nothing gets done. The reality is we don't have all that money yet. The inclusionary zoning, which allows a developer to buy out of his responsibilities to create affordable housing. Incidentally, when I was on board, the number was this big. I proposed and the town board changed the code that required that the developers spend substantially more to buy out because it was too small. And if he didn't want to buy the affordable house, give us the money, we'll do it for you. Well, what happened was that money, that $1 million he talked about, that's the result of the buyout for the Heritage and Cutjog, which is under construction. You do not get the money until the units are each sold. So the money is coming in dribs and drabs. We will have $1 million. We've already allocated $250,000 of the money we do have to the Vineyard View. I know.
No, I'm just
to the Vineyard for the Vineyard View in Greenport. So yes, we are using that money, and we're going to develop a plan. So as that $1 million shows up, we're going to figure out how to use it in the most efficient way possible to produce the most affordable housing we can for the least amount of money. And we look forward to developing that plan over the next year.
Mr. Doroski, you are running for town supervisor. What are the areas that concern you, that propelled you to want to run for supervisor? And if elected, what would you like to accomplish?
Thank you. That was a lot. So thank you all for being here. And, you know, Mattituck is my hometown. You know, I graduated from Mattituck High School in 1999. Sorry, Greg Doroski. Thank you. Graduated Mattituck High School in 99, grew up in Mattituck Presbyterian Church. And I just consider myself so fortunate to have grown up in our community and to be influenced by our values. The community, the service, the closeness. We're close-knit. My wife Liz and I are both committed to raising our kids in this community. You know, to give them the same opportunities that we had growing up here in the community where my family goes all the way back to the 1640s. And when I look around, I know we can do better. You know, while it's great that we just updated the code to allow oyster farmers to sell their oysters at roadside stands, it's unacceptable to me that it took this administration 6 years to get this update on the books. While it's great that we're finally nearing the completion of the comprehensive plan, it's unacceptable to me that the original timeline of 18 months ballooned to 10 years. And we're still not even really talking about prioritization or implementation. There are so many areas in our town where we can do better, and we need to do better. Now, I have a plan to support the installation of innovative and alternative wastewater systems by launching a pilot program to take a small 2% portion of the Community Preservation Fund to provide grants to bridge loans, or to bridge the county and the state grants that are currently available. Just next year, Suffolk County plans on installing 1,200 of these systems. We need to be a partner and collaborate with the county and the state, not be a naysayer. I have a plan to foster and support the construction of accessory affordable apartments by launching a pilot program to take some of this money out of this inclusionary zoning fund, like we did for Vineyard View, and give it to homeowners to support the construction of affordable accessory apartments. I have a plan to support smart, intelligent economic growth and innovation that includes updating the code to allow food producers like Backyard Brine, who are located in industrially zoned parcels, to sell their pickles directly to consumers. And I have plans for a lot of different things that we need to address in Southold Town. But beyond just having a plan, I have the experience of starting and growing a business with my partners. I know what it takes to get the job done. Together, we built out a raw 10,000 square foot warehouse space to be one of the country's top breweries. We went from 5 to 50 employees. And we created and implemented all of the systems to manage our staff, our finances, and our operations. We did this, and we built, I'm proud to say, a successful multi-million-dollar company that's still in existence today. As I look at the challenges that we face as a community, I think the skills that I learned there are super important here. The importance of urgency, the importance of collaboration and openness, the importance of consulting other people that have solved similar problems to get their input and help us work together towards common sense solutions. I hope I can count on your support. Thank you.
The next question, Mr. Russell, you can take this one first. Plans were recently submitted for a major recreational facility in Peconic after a failed attempt to build in Mattituck. That was a big topic for a couple of years there. How has the town worked with the developers to find a suitable location for this facility that many residents seem to be in support of? And how has the adopting different zoning to accommodate such a facility?
Sure. Actually, the issue in Mattituck, just for a very quick history, and I know I went on a little too long before, and I'll try to be brief, but the issue in Mattituck was this guy had this wonderful proposal to build on 20 acres. That was going to be the sports recreational facility, indoor pool, the whole thing clearly identified as a public need. The problem at the time was it was residential zoning. And residential zoning doesn't permit commercial recreational facilities. It does promote membership clubs. The challenge at the time was, which is this? Is it a membership club or is it a commercial recreational facility? And ultimately, that was a tough answer that had to be answered, and it was found to not be permitted by code. What happened was Southold Town developed a plan to say, look, we need it in the right locations. We developed an overlay district, which is a recreational overlay district, which essentially would permit all of those uses in what we call an overlay zone. Find the property, lay that zone over the property regardless of the underlying use, and permit the facility. The thing is, what's nice about overlay zoning is that the zoning stays intact until you get a specific project that you know is going to be viable. We acquired 10 acres in Peconic, right next to what would be Tasker Park. I don't know if the tennis courts, the lit ones over on the east side. Well, there's 10 acres right across the street. Probably don't know because there's a lot of brambles and everything. But 10 acres, the town purchased it. It came up for sale. We jumped on it. That's proactive. That's not reactive. That's proactive. We put the zoning in place. We RFP'd the request for proposals out to the general community, to everybody, to say, bring us your proposal back. This is what we want. We need two things from you, an indoor pool, and you need to show us how it's going to benefit the residents of Southold Town more than anybody else. Because what you don't want is to permit a facility, then have membership fees that are so high, the locals are excluded from it. All right, we did get the proposal back from the same developer that was in Mattituck. It's a very good proposal. We're working out the process now. You know, a lot of it's negotiation because ultimately it's going to have to go for a change of zone. So we're working out the details now. We're teasing those out. And hopefully in the near future, he'll have a finished product to present to the town board so we can have a public hearing so everybody can look at the project and the public can come out and speak their mind and say, yes, we need it, no, we don't.
Mr. Doroski, how have you viewed the town board's handling of this facility during these past few years?
So our community has needed a pool and a multi-use recreational facility since I was a kid. You know, we used to have to travel up the island to play indoor soccer. We haven't had a pool, you know. And you know, there's members of our community, people that go to my church that are forced to do, training up in East Hampton. This community has needed this asset for so long. And I support this proposal that's going, but I have real concerns whether we're going to be able to bring it to the finish line. You know, there's kind of a headline that we're going to do this facility, but there's not much meat on the bones. And there's some real challenges to running a pool, which is very expensive, to running a sports facility, which is very expensive, and to building a facility like this. You know, the way I look at it, I don't see how this developer can do it for anything less than a $5 to $7 million investment. There's going to be some real challenges to make that affordable for the community and to make it profitable for the developer. And I have concerns that the town has already purchased this property with the intent to use it for this purpose without knowing if we're going to be able to bring it to conclusion. I think ideally small business and private enterprise should be able to solve this issue for us. And I have concerns that we're putting an overlay zone to allow a use that wasn't allowed in a residential zone, which is the same exact zoning. This piece of property is an AC zoned piece of property, and we're just using an overlay district to allow it there. I have real concerns whether we can make this practically work in reality.
Would you like a 1-minute rebuttal?
Quick response? Or
Sure.
We'll go on to the next. It's really, it doesn't matter.
Up to you if you want to respond.
Oh, yeah, okay. Look, let me just say, first of all, it is a private investment. I don't have those concerns. The developer needs to weigh whether it's going to work for him or not. If they're based on the track record of the particular applicant, he's going to get it done. And he's going to get it done based on our experiences, what we've seen elsewhere, all right? Ultimately, there's always going to be some risk. But the reality is, if you don't, you can't say we needed it for years, Oh, but you know what, there might be too much risk in this. There is always risk. But sometimes if you need something bad enough, if you want something bad enough, you need to take that risk. That's a risk we're willing to take. We bought that 10 acres right next to a recreational hub. Even if we didn't get a proposal for that site, for the facility, we had bought 10 acres at incidentally under market value that we could have utilized as part of our recreational hub, which is right there, ball fields, lacrosse, or anything you need. So it had a lot of thought in mind. We didn't just rush pell-mell. It was an opportunity. We seized it.
Picking up on a topic, obviously we discussed with the town board as well, with water quality. Mr. Doroski, if you want to start off with this one, you've been critical of the way the town's handled certain water quality issues and saying that for 14 years, Mr. Russell has done little to improve our water quality except provide excuses. Can you elaborate on what you think should have been done and what you would like to do if you're elected?
So pollution from outdated septic systems is one of the leading causes of pollution. And this is a threat to our groundwater and to our surface water. And this water is vital to our community. It sustains us and it's part of who we are. It supports the fishing and aquaculture industries and we drink it. And when I look at the wait-and-see attitude for supporting innovative and alternative wastewater treatment systems, I can't help but shake my head. This is something that the county and the state have been supporting with grants. So this is not only an environmental issue, it's an economic issue that could provide an influx of money to people that are going to be installing these systems. But more important, these systems are going to benefit our whole community. As my colleagues have pointed out, we have systems, outdated septic systems, that pretty much drain directly into our bay. This is unacceptable. And I think with the current grant funding that's available from the county and the state, the town can help provide grants to bridge this gap that we've all talked about, to cover the engineering costs, to cover the maintenance costs, and to help incentivize people to install these systems. This is a public benefit. And when I hear the administration say that these systems are unproven, or when they roll out fear tactics that we're going to slap everyone with a $20,000 bill, that's just not reality. The science shows these systems reduce nitrogen. Nitrogen is a threat. There is grant funding available. These are facts. We need to do our part as a town to be a collaborating partner with the county and the state, and not a naysayer. Because this money is there for us to use. And if we don't use it, other communities are going to use it. You know, we were attending a panel discussion on these systems a while back, and it really struck me that in Southold Town, we've only installed 15 of these innovative and alternative wastewater treatment systems as of March. We can do better than that. And I think it's up to the town board and the supervisor to commit to doing that. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just first clarify. There's two issues of water quality that we need to consider: surface water quality and groundwater quality. Surface water quality, the runoff through creeks to the bays, to the sounds to our water bodies, from the roads, road runoff, which greatly impairs water bodies. The town has made substantial investments. We've pulled back roads. We've installed drainage systems, all sorts of creative new solutions, and we're getting there. Because you know why? We have volunteers that go out and test the waters. They go to private labs, and guess what? The water's getting cleaner. It's getting cleaner and cleaner and cleaner because of the commitments we've made. All right, now let's talk about groundwater quality. And I'm sorry, I do not mean to use the idea of a $20,000 invoice as a scare tactic. But my opponent said precisely that. Sooner or later, we're going to have to mandate these systems. What does that mean? It means that homeowners, particularly with cesspools, because remember, they don't work on a cesspool, these new filtration systems, would have to spend about $20,000 at least to install one of these systems. I'm not willing to make the taxpayers foot the bill for what's a regional problem. That's the easy way out. We need to find creative sources of revenue, create new sources of revenue, and help that along. And incidentally, I'm disappointed to find out I haven't done anything for 14 years about the use of IA systems. Suffolk County Department of Health just approved these systems for use on residential properties a mere few years ago. So it really wasn't, it was beyond my scope of authority to require IA systems. The trustees require them, the ZBA requires them. I will disagree with Mr. Hanlon when he says that they are not really charged with policy. The trustees actually operate under what's called the Andros patent. They actually have more authority than the town board that goes back beyond the creation of the town. So they absolutely do that. Incidentally, the town board outside of the ZBA and the trustees for major subdivisions requires no IA systems. But let's not put all our eggs in one basket. There are other alternatives that are out there that we also need to look at. And I look forward to partnering with Suffolk County on addressing areas of real concern. All that commercial activity on Love Lane, we need to bring them together and create what's called the sub-regional sewering system, using IA technology, but on a grouped approach. We could do that with housing. We can do that in other areas. That might substantially reduce the cost per home or per hookup. I know it'll not only improve the water quality in Love Lane, it might give the people of Love Lane, the businesses, the opportunity to invest in themselves and expand their businesses, because now they're able to create more septic flow and still have an environmental impact that's much less than what's currently there.
Go ahead.
So other municipalities have figured out how to require these systems. And when we talk about requiring systems and setting a timeline for mandating them, why not start with mandating what the trustees and the ZBA and the planning board are already requiring? Why not set that out clearly in the code so everyone's expectations in the community are aligned and so people can plan for these? I've heard from builders that are concerned that they get to the trustees and all of a sudden there's a requirement to install one of these systems, and their argument is it's not in the code. Yes, the trustees are requiring it, but the trustees need the support of the board to put these requirements in code. And yes, down the road, these systems, yes, are going to need to be mandated in Southold Town. But there is a long runway to get us there. And we need to start with an incremental approach, step by step, to say where we want these systems now, where we want them in 5 years, where we want them in 10 years, where we want them in 2050. I think by setting those expectations, it allows people to plan for their futures. It serves as a motivating factor for people to utilize the existing grant funding that's already there. And even though these systems were approved, a number of years ago, Southampton has already figured out how to mandate it in their code to require these systems to be installed when they're doing substantial renovations, when they're doing change of residence. These are big projects. We can roll in the costs, and there's grant funding available to support the installation of these systems. This is funding that is available now. We need to take advantage of the funding now. We can't wait.
Thank you. Mr. Russell, question from the audience. The question is, how will you create or stimulate decent paying jobs to keep younger people here? And in addressing that, to speak about the accessory apartment issue, which seems to tie into the job issue of keeping young people here, and what you would like to accomplish on the accessory apartment issue.
Sure. Okay, first and foremost is stimulating the economy for younger people, small business. Google's not coming here, Amazon's not coming here. We need to promote small business. Southold Town about 4 or 5 years ago created what we call a pre-submission conference. Someone has a business idea, they come to us, we put all the decision makers in one room, the department, zoning, planning, town attorney, myself, and we vet that application or vet that idea with the applicant. We put all that expertise there to support them, to identify with them what process they will have to go through. And incidentally, there may be some challenges. Let's identify those challenges now, and then we'll figure out and we'll help you overcome those challenges. That's promoting small business. We've created an economic advisory commission whose function is to go out and bring education out to the community, helping people develop a business plan, of finding grant opportunities that are available. Very active group. They've recently, with the new chair, have developed a new life. They're out there having fireside chats. They're doing all these things. That's the way you do it. You promote small business. And also, let's not forget, farms are small business. The town has been working with the Ag Advisory Committee, and we have for years. We've made substantial changes to the code. We talk about, well, the oyster farms took so long. It took 6 years. But you know what? The reality is that the oyster code comes on, and then we work at the basically at the priorities set by the Agricultural Advisory Committee. So what happened was we found out, well, if aquaculture, we need a definition. Well, okay, while we're doing that, let's change all the definitions. So we were getting work out on a regular basis, but not every time the shortest point between point A and point B. It might be a straight line, but it's not always the most effective line. Sometimes you have to move with the challenges, and that's why things like that had taken some time.
So, Mr. Doroski, the question from the audience was, how can the town promote decent jobs that keep the young people here, and how does that issue tie in or dovetail with the accessory apartment issue?
One of the biggest things you hear from small business owners in Southold Town is that there's uncertainty. Our code is outdated. It needs to be updated. And this administration has struggled to update the comprehensive plan to serve as a foundation for updating the code. And I think we're seeing this impacting businesses around our community. Businesses that need updates to the code to clarify and to reflect the modern realities. As my colleague Sarah pointed out, there's been this push in the wine industry to clarify the differences between agriculture, between production, and tasting rooms. This is something they've called for, and this is something that this administration has failed to solve. And while it's easy to attack me for saying that I want to, turn this town into a frat house by supporting breweries, breweries are in the same position. There's a difference between agriculture, production, and tasting. And it's not enough just to demonize these industries and say they're bad and, they're going to turn this community into something that it's not. Or I, as a candidate, have some tie to some special interest group, or Sarah's the same thing. These are real, good-paying jobs in our community. And we need a code that reflects current realities. I mentioned Backyard Brine. They're in an industrially zoned building, and they've been asking the town to update the code to allow them to sell directly to consumers. By forcing them to sell only through distributors, we're forcing them to be a bigger business than they may want to be. We're forcing them to take debts that they may not want to take. These are all areas that we, as a town board, we have the power to update the code. It's not enough to say these things are not allowed in the code when we're the ones charged with writing the code. And as this relates to accessory apartments, one of the other big challenges that we hear from all people in the community, and especially from small business owners, is that it's hard to find staff out here. Because no matter how good the job is, if there's not a place to live that you can afford, it's not going to attract you here. This is where our community really needs to look at all of the issues that we're facing and look at them from kind of a comprehensive, holistic perspective. And without this comprehensive plan that we've been dragging our feet on for 10 years, we're dealing with all of these issues in isolation. We need to do better on this. The people of our community and the character of our community depends on it.
Mr. Russell.
Yeah, I actually forgot to address the accessory apartment issue before. This is a good example of the challenges we have. Under the current code, the accessory apartment law, not the affordable, that's a different law, but the accessory apartment code requires that the primary resident live on site to have the accessory apartment. There's a problem with that. A lot of people that live out here 3-4 days a week but have their residency in New York, or maybe they claim their residency in Florida for tax purposes, and I certainly don't begrudge on that. The problem is that it removes the potential for apartment inventory. So what I proposed was one small change. Rather than require that it be their primary resident, I made it so my proposal was so that it be at the exclusive use of the owner. So the only person that could live there would be the owner. The accessory apartment would have to be occupied by a year-round resident, but only the owner could use. So no, there isn't a potential for two-family housing. Now, how do we enforce that? Well, we have a new rental code. That's how you enforce that. We have the right to inspect the property. We have the right to require for leases. One other thing I want to say talks about the comp plan. Well, we need to, we dragged our feet for a decade. The fact is that the comp plan, when we originally targeted 18 months, we found out a couple of things. First is 2009, we're coming out of an economic recession, and changes are happening real fast. They're really going quickly. And what we said was, look, we can give this, excuse me, to a consultant. We're going to get a six-figure invoice. We're going to get nominal public participation, and we're going to get it done in 18 months. And guess what? It's going to be out of date in 5 or 6 years. So what we did is we took our time, chapter by chapter, 13 in all. We had unprecedented public participation, 64 community meetings as we completed each chapter. We then went back and reviewed chapters to update them as times changed. Also, regarding implementation, we've been implementing the comprehensive master plan for years now. We've implemented changes. Every decision we make is based on the whole concept of what we call halo zones. Zoning that's more permissive in and around the hamlet centers, and zoning that's a little bit less permissive and more residential agriculture and outside the halo zones. We've basically identified areas, Mattituck, we said we need more parking. Pike Street came up for sale, Pike Street parking lot, we bought it in an instant. That's being proactive. We've been implementing this plan right along. Also, if you read the actual plan and the back of the plan, it outlines the steps and goals. What's next for us? What's next is to create, again, substantial amount of community meetings, get substantial amount of community input, identify priorities, identify timetables, and get the ball rolling. With regard to amending the code to accommodate businesses, we've been doing that right along as well. In fact, we do allow retailing in industrial zones. The problem is the retailing in the industrial zones needs to be in the industrial properties in and around the halo area, which is where we said we want commercial activity to take place, where we want retailing. That's the whole purpose of zoning. If we start allowing retailing up north of the landfill, then we're going to have impacts on not just the residential community on the other side, but on other industries. It's hard to get all these different industries where you try to cluster those uses so they're more appropriate uses. But had they found a site in the industrial zones, plenty of vacant buildings in the halo zones, they could have retailed. Had they come to us, we certainly would have directed them and sent them in the right direction. With regard to the accessory apartments, again, the reason I did that was if you talk to business, the biggest challenge they have is housing. And we need to make it work. The accessory apartment code that I had proposed, which was a minor change and completely enforceable, was designed to do one thing. Yes, we can't put every apartment in the downtowns, but we can rely on the existing inventory. Why build new when you have structures already? That's consistent with the town's plan. That's consistent with preservation. Utilize the existing inventory. That includes the existing housing stock.
Thank you. For Mr. Doroski, you've criticized the current short-term rental law and said if businesses like Airbnb have innovated in our territory and we would need to innovate back. Do you think there needs to be stricter enforcement against short-term rentals or changes to the law as it's written?
So I think if we look at the results of the short-term rental law, we see that it's not effective as it needs to be. As my colleague Bob pointed out, if you look on Airbnb and VRBO, a few weeks ago there were 100 listings there. There was an article in Newsday probably about 6 weeks ago where it said short-term rentals in Suffolk County were up by 20%. And this was after almost a 40% increase the year before. I think the way the code is written, it's burdensome to enforce, to say the least. And this summer, we did not have nearly enough enforcement agents to enforce the code, and I think we see the impacts of that in the reality that there's so many short-term rentals listed on these websites. I think a simple solution to this, and something we've talked about as a slate of candidates, is to require all listings to list your permit number. So if someone is listing an apartment illegally, short-term, we can send them a letter, a violation, to the permit, and they're in violation of the terms of their permit, the number of which is listed on all of these listings. I think technology companies try to disrupt the economy to make it work for them. But we need to disrupt what they're doing to make it work for the people of our community. You know, in 2010, the census showed that only 10% of the housing units in Southold Town were long-term rentals. I guarantee you that number's less because all of the short-term rentals. And this is putting real stress on our community. And this is an area where we don't need to create new density. These are apartments that are already there that people are renting illegally.
Yeah, let me just quickly go back and cover the history. When the town created a legislative amendment that basically prohibited short-term rentals or less than 14 nights, we made it clear when we adopted it that nobody should view it as a panacea. It was only the first step. The second step needed to be a rental code. The rental code just went into effect in August. We believe it's going to make the first code much more enforceable. I know Mr. Hanlon stood up before and said, well, I was on the website recently and saw 85 rentals there. Yes, and we all know about the one or two that are operating in our communities. 85 rentals. How many were there 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 4 years ago? You need to remember when you adopt code, don't be so cynical. At first, you do get substantial compliance, but there are bad actors out there, no doubt. At least we've narrowed the pool. We also stopped people from investing in the more modest houses so that they could go to the Airbnb model and carry the cost of the house. So yes, we have made the difference. The 85 today, again, at one point the estimate by their own industry was they had 643 operating out there. I guarantee you the number's less than half that now. But now that we have the rental code in place, we're going to be able to enforce it even more. Now that we have the personnel in place, we're going to be able to enforce it even more, and I think you're going to see substantial changes by next spring. One other thing I want to say, Mr. Hanlon said, well, look, the rental code, all you have to do is put in there is if you advertise, you automatically void your permit. Actually, if you took the time to read the Airbnb code or the short-term rental code, we have in there a provision, what's called a presumption of guilt. If you're advertising on a website, you would presume to be guilty. All right, we don't have that anymore because it turns out the Constitution doesn't like towns that create codes under the premise you're guilty till you come in and prove us that you're innocent. And that's why that's an unenforceable component. But again, that rental permit was a key critical component that we let the community know that we're going to need to make the code we passed previously to make it work.
Mr. Doroski.
This idea of making a code that's more enforceable and clearer and more well-written needs to be central to everything we do. And I think the idea that I presented to require people that are listing the apartments to list their permit number is a step in the right direction. Because even if we have an enforcement agent on every single corner, it's really hard to prove that people are violating these laws. There are technological solutions that other communities have employed to scrape information from these sites where people are listing their apartments illegally. And if we require them to have their permit number, we can issue them a violation of that permit number, or of the permit. I think this is a step in the right direction, and I think we're seeing the impacts of these short-term rentals on our community. You know, I think if you look at some of the other problems that we're having with speculators coming into our community and pushing local people out of our community, the short-term rentals are just one area that they're doing this. And our town board needs to give the people of our community a fighting chance by preventing these people and disincentivizing these people from coming in, speculating on these houses, and turning them into short-term rentals.
Next question, I want to go back on something you both have touched on. It was certainly a major theme of the town board questions as well, and that is, what is your vision for farmland use and what should be permitted and what should be excluded on farmland? You both have had letters to the editor on this subject. It clearly affects every community, every hamlet in the town. These are neighborhood wineries, and people live near them. I'll start with you, Mr. Russell. What is your vision of what should be permitted and where should we be going in terms of the uses of farmland?
Okay. Well, one of the things I can point to as to what I think should be permitted is some of the stuff I've already supported and the town has adopted, which is processing on farms. Now, I know my opponent and the people running for the town board, as well, it languished forever. Well, the reality is, like I said, we had been working on other things with the Ag Advisory Committee that needed to be done first, define processing. You also have to remember that you have to get a committee, develop consensus in a committee who have very different goals and very different ideas about farming. But we got it done. What's disappointing to me is that while they both, Mr. Hanlon, Mr. Doroski, and Ms. Napa, had criticized how long it took the town to get done, not one of the three of them spoke at the public hearing as to whether they even supported it or not. Now, it did have some opposition. Well, people, Glennis Berry, Peconic Green Growth, because it's of the water consumption. But let me tell you, there's no reason to presume that processing is going to consume more water than traditional farming. In fact, I'd submit that it accomplishes two goals. Number one, it possibly gets farming back to farming food, which this town needs to do. Secondly, there's no reason to presume that someone processing food is going to use more water than that sod farm. And if you look at the farmland out there, I would venture to guess about 40% of the farmland that's active is probably in sod right now, certainly 30%. What do I see for a future? I do see smaller farms. I actually support changes to the code, some which have been made, which would allow people who have sold development rights to subdivide their land. In the old days, you couldn't do that. I think you can do it now, if I'm not mistaken. In the old days, if you sold 80 acres, 80 acres had to stay intact. The problem with that is that's how you get the solar eaves and the only people that can afford to buy it. I do think that that people that sell development rights should be able to subdivide. I also believe that we need to ease the restrictions, the PDRs, what we call the easement restrictions. I just recently had a meeting with the Ag Advisory and the Land Preservation Committee. I think there's a lot of common ground there to say, look, some of these easements are maybe too restrictive. We might need to give more flexibility to farmers, like processing, possibly limited retailing, which currently are prohibited in most, if not all, easements. We need to be more flexible with those easements, and we need to allow for smaller farms. So what we can do is see the difference or the variety of agriculture that we're going to. Agriculture is going to be much more diverse down the road. I'll agree with my opponents on that. It'll get much more diverse than it is right now.
Mr. Doroski.
The expression festina lenta comes to mind, make haste slowly. I think the problem that we've seen with this administration is that they drag their feet and then rush at the end. And I think this agricultural processing update that the supervisor is referencing is a great example of this. This update had languished for years, and then finally at the end, just happens to be around an election time, we rush things along. They didn't consult the Water Conservation Committee, and that's the chair of the Water Conservation Committee got up to raise her concerns about it. She wrote a letter to the Suffolk Times expressing her concerns about it. How does an update take us so long, and then we fail to consult people? It boggles the mind. Now, my vision of our community, agriculture is core to that. Aquaculture is core to that. Small businesses are core to that. And these industries and the people in these industries need a government that supports them. I think when you look at the aquaculture industry and how the code update to allow aquaculturists to sell their oysters at roadside stands, when it languished for 6 years, there were 20 leaseholders in this area when they started addressing that update. And by the time they finally made that update, there were 10. That's unacceptable to me. How does a simple update take 6 years? For me, this is about leadership. As I've sat in these agricultural advisory committees, as I've sat in the code committee meetings where they talked about restricting house size for the first time. What was clear to me is there was an absence of leadership in leading the discussion to a solution that works for the people of our community. Without implementing updates to make these businesses profitable, we run the risk of transforming our community into something that we don't recognize. And I think we see that slowly happening. We need a town board that supports these industries and is motivated to get these updates done now.
Mr. Russell, do you want to respond?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Again, I talked before about why some of the things take longer than others, the aquaculture code. Just to go back and let everybody know, actually people that were harvesting or growing aquaculture have been able to retail it right along, and they have for about over a decade. The only difference was they would have had to have done it at an existing farm operation, which does allow people to sell, other farmers to sell their products from an ag operation. So yes, it took us a little bit longer, but again, we're working hand in hand with the Ag Advisory Committee. Now, my opponent just said, well, the Water Conservation Committee wasn't consulted. That's sometimes the problem. You're not going to be able to make 2 or 3 committees happy because they have different goals, and they're all well-intended. But the reality is, the processing was essential to agriculture. There was a clear path, and we had to take it. We took the recommendations of the Ag Advisory Committee. No, we didn't stop. It's funny because we get accused of saying, well, you took so long to do this, you took so long to do that. But wait, why didn't you include everybody in the process and bog this thing down through committee review, Sometimes you have a clear path, sometimes you have to take it. And I know that might have made some of the other people on another committee unhappy, but the town has to set priorities. Sometimes you can't reconcile all interests. Let me just say for a second, for the record, I never would have accused my opponent, and I'm not suggesting you accuse me, of wanting to turn farms into frat houses. Making beer, brewmaster, that's his industry. He's a professional, and I have no doubt that he's sincere about what he sees as a necessity. Personally, I don't support breweries or distilleries on farmland. Under current New York State Ag and Markets law, it does not require you to grow any of your own products. The reason you allow retail operations, whether it's selling, tomatoes, or whether it's selling beer, or whether it's selling spirits, is the whole purpose is to make sure the farmland in the back is being farmed. New York State Ag and Markets does not require it. All it requires is that you buy only 20% of what you're processing from another New York State agricultural grower. I'm going to be candid. I don't really care about the agricultural health of Herkimer County. I care about the agricultural health of Southold Town. So if we're going to permit these expanded uses, make sure there's a component that requires they grow what they're going to produce. Every other ag operator in Southold Town is required to, whether they're producing or selling, they're required to, for the most part, to produce their own products. I know I was accused earlier of, for 10 years, trying to divide the winery industry from, I guess, the other industries. The reality is, under the current code, the winery industry has the most permissive zoning in place. It's even more permissive than most other ag codes and other ag operators, and all I've been trying to do right along is to treat them the same. That's all I've been trying to do. And you know what? I'll give you a good example. In order to process right now, you have to process your own products on site. You can open a winery tomorrow, and you do not have to grow one grape. Not one grape. All you need is 10 acres planted. You can plant it in privets. You could plant it in anything you want. And then another 2 acres to build the winery. We had a proposal. Someone wanted to build a 4,500 square foot winery in Mattituck. They didn't want to grow grapes. Yeah, a couple of acres of grapes, but that wasn't the farm operation. That was the landscaping. That was to set the aesthetic setting. They had no interest in growing grapes. And yes, I did propose something a few years ago that said if you want a winery, you have to grow grapes. And yes, the winery community came out and hammered me. Special events legislation, every time I try to put a comma in the winery code, I get hammered. But the reality is, all I try to do is treat everybody the same. No segment, no business segment of agriculture, no business in Southold Town is any more or less important than the other.
Mr. Doroski.
It's kind of disappointing that you're still citing that information that you can just use 20% of goods from an upstate community, because I actually clarified that at our last discussion. With local rule, we have the ability to mandate, just as Riverhead does, that farm breweries need to source their materials from our town. We have that ability. We have the ability to update the vineyard code to require that X amount of acres be planted in grapes. This administration has failed to do that. The industries have been asking for these updates, and they're not there. At a certain point, you can't blame it on someone else. This sits in our lap. We need to update the code to reflect the realities of these businesses and what works for the people of our community. I don't think anyone in any of these industries that we're talking about, or at least the good actors, thinks that you should have a tasting room in a residential community. That's a red herring argument. What we need to do is figure out how to support the business of agriculture. And if we want to allow some processing with it, that's good. If we want to allow some retail sales but no consumption, let's talk about that. There's various points along this spectrum that we need to discuss. And I think this is where industry expertise is so important. And it's unfair to the industries, it's unfair to the people of our community that we're dragging our feet for so long to update these things. And it's putting people out of business. It's forcing young people out of our community. They're going to more forward-looking communities that have had the motivation to figure these issues out. These are solvable problems where we can learn from what others have done and figure out what works for the people of our community. There's no other option. We need to update the code.
Our final question of the night, I'll start with you, Mr. Russell, and then you both have closing statements after that. But I want to talk about the hamlet, Mattituck, and the main road and the moratorium and the move by the board towards taking some steps towards eminent domain. What is your vision for that curve of the road there, and what steps has the board taken and should take to get where you want to get, which is a pedestrian-friendly area?
Yeah, I know, and this is probably out of process, and I'll answer that in 1 second, but I do want to say one thing. There's no such thing as local home rule on breweries. If you accept them as an allowed use in wineries on farmland, you have to follow ag and markets law. It trumps all others. And no, there isn't a requirement to grow your own crops. Another thing is, let me just tell you, with regard to the moratorium, the fact of the matter is a good example of a community and town coordinated effort. Recognized there are issues at Love Lane, and I had gone to a meeting up in Mattituck, very active group, Mattituck Rural Civic Association, and we had talked about how to address it. I said, well, what we should do is a study, because if we're going to go to the Department of Transportation, New York State, which owns the road, they're going to want basically what we call an engineered plan. They're going to know what do you want to do here before they even budget for it. So that's what we did. Legislator Krupski found the money. We went ahead with the plan for the Love Lane, that specific intersection. We had a lot of groups, a lot of people from the community put ideas on the table, put the plan out. It's evaluating 4 or 5 different options. The traffic circle is but one. I do want to temper expectations if you think a traffic circle is going to be there. It may not. Our only victory a few months ago that you might have read about was to get the state to at least consider it, because before that they dismissed it out of hand. There's always the one option in any study, and that is the option to do nothing. That's a requirement because they recognize that sometimes maybe solutions are worse than the problem. But right now it's in the state DOT's hands. However, what the town recognized was, well, look, we're going to have an impact here on Love Lane, but we can go back. We have 8 streets that come into the main road from Pike Street down by the high school all the way back to Bay Avenue, which is where the Hess station is, or whatever the name of it is now. So what we need to do is put a moratorium in place and take a step back, larger picture of this whole area. Moratoriums, yes, they're not always the most pleasant thing in the world, but sometimes you need to take a snapshot in time Make sure that picture doesn't change so that you can figure out what the new picture is going to look like. That's why we instituted a moratorium. We also broadened the scope of the study to look at not just the traffic, but the land use impacts. With regard to the parcel that I know was probably something you were talking about, Mr. Hanlon talked before about these early studies and if we had just acted, First of all, I know my opponent recently ran an ad that said, the Brinkman property, whatever he said, 2004, no action, 2005, no action, 2006, no action, 2007, no action. Well, you know what? Really what the ad should have said? 2006, not for sale. 2007, not for sale. 2008, not for sale. 2009, not for sale. We tried, we reached out to the owners over the years. There was no interest in selling. When it sold in 2011, first of all, the time it sold before that, I believe I wasn't even supervisor yet. I do not know. Maybe I had just gotten in office. When it was sold in 2011, it wasn't really what you would call an open market sale. It wasn't put on the market to be sold. It was a client who had offered it to the bank because he knew the bank, Bridgehampton National, was looking to build a new branch. And he had this parcel, so that was an exchange between two parties, arm's length, their business, not ours, but it wasn't actively put on the market. When it finally was, again, the town acted quickly. We partnered with Suffolk County. We were at the table. We were negotiating right along. Ultimately, they chose to sell to another party. The fact of the matter is, we tried working with the new party. We tried. It was I shouldn't say almost impossible. It was impossible. They didn't want to listen. So the reality is, we took the bold step of declaring or authorizing the attorney to pursue an eminent domain proceeding. We haven't done the proceeding yet, but we gave them the authority to, because sometimes you need to take bold action. And now, actually the owner of the property said they're willing to discuss with the town the prospect of a sale. So those discussions are ongoing. With reference to the studies, if we had just acted on them, I know Mr. Hanlon referenced the traffic study, the corridor study of 2011. Actually, if you look at that study, it identified the need for a community green space and that parcel as one of the possible locations. However, it also did identify that area, including that parcel, and basically they said, look, if you want to concentrate your development, you need to concentrate it within this region of the village. So it also said, well, it could be a park, but you know what, if you're going to allow for more intense development, this is where you want to do it, which includes a park. So be careful, do not look for studies to provide the leadership. You need to provide the leadership based on what you think is in the best interest of the town. We tried to buy it. We made a fair offer. It went to a new party. We're addressing it now. We're negotiating with the current owners, and we think a sale is much more likely than eminent domain.
Mr. Doroski.
Just think about this for a moment. We have a 14-year incumbent that says he needs a moratorium to stop time. What happened during the past 14 years that we couldn't figure this thing out? This parcel was called out for preservation in 2005. And even though there wasn't a for sale sign there, we could, as a business person, I know we could have reached out to them to figure out how to purchase the land. And if anything, the Brinkmans figured out how to purchase the land. Why couldn't we figure it out? Why did we wait to take serious action until the Mattituck Laurel Civic Association really started advocating for this issue? I think everyone in Mattituck owes a real debt of gratitude to the Mattituck Laurel Civic Association because they really kicked this thing into gear. This administration was just sitting around watching this happen. I would have to think if we finish the comprehensive plan in some sort of reasonable amount of time, we would have talked about the risk of overdevelopment in this area. We would have talked about the parcels that need to be preserved. And I think what concerns me beyond just this particular parcel is other parcels in town that are at risk of overdevelopment and that should potentially be preserved. But without a comprehensive plan, without a unified vision for what it is we want for the community, we're left with this kind of ad hoc approach where we're reacting to a plan that someone else wants to do, or we're just waiting for a civic association to say to us, we want this park. The Mattituck Laurel Civic Association, when they reached out to the town for this park, cited the very study that we're talking about here. These are various studies that have been done. This section, this corner that we're talking about here has been dangerous since I was a kid. And we do traffic studies and traffic studies and traffic studies, but we don't take any action. And yes, it's a state road, but it's not enough for us as a town, for your leaders to say, oh, well, it's their problem. This is our problem. These are our problems that demand solutions from us. We need to advocate for what we need as a community. Thank you.
Mr. Russell. And then we'll move to final statements.
Okay, yeah, let me just point out one thing, and I want to repeat myself. The property wasn't for sale. It was never for sale. The process for acquisition, whether it was 2004, 2005, or whatever year it was, would have been the same as it is now, which would have been eminent domain. All right, the town can't force someone to sell you the property if they're not interested in selling, but ultimately, if you need to buy it, you go eminent domain. 2006, 2019 would have been the same process. All right, and look, we talk about the comprehensive master plan, we talk about the vision, we talk about all these things that we need. Again, we have already been acting on the comprehensive master plan. We did not sit back and wait for it to be finished. We've been taking an active approach and utilizing it in our decision-making from the beginning. And sometimes, I think, to say, well, we should have anticipated this, we should have anticipated that, but I got to be honest. There's a lot of challenges that we don't have in Southold because they have been anticipated. But yes, we're going to have challenges from time to time. And it's either extremely naive or extremely arrogant to think that we can come up with a plan that's going to avoid all these challenges. No plan is a Kevlar vest, all right? It won't protect you from everything. But what will happen when you face those challenges? What determines leadership? It's how they respond to those challenges and the kind of success they're going to have in meeting those challenges. That's what defines leadership.
So let's go to our final statements. Greg, you go first. Mr. Doroski, you go first. And try to hold it to maybe 2 minutes. Appreciate it.
So as I've said, I'm running for supervisor because we can do better. And while that may seem like an empty political phrase, I really do believe we can do better. I think the Mattituck Laurel Civic Association put it best when they wrote last year in their 3 requests document that we cannot afford to wait for the implementation of the well-informed recommendations of the 2005 Hamlet study, the 2008 stakeholder study, the 2010-2011 quarter study, all of the traffic studies that have been done, and the long-delayed, long-overdue comprehensive plan. Because to wait is to watch rather than to manage change. And these aren't my words, but they're important. To wait is to watch rather than to manage change. And I think far too often that's what we've seen this administration do. We need to get out ahead of these problems. We need to create the reality that the people of our community want and deserve. I think the business experience that I have of growing and launching a business, of taking an idea and making it a reality, are really important to the problems that we're facing as a community. Our community does not have the luxury to wait 5, 10 years to get updates to the code. How do we expect a code that there's concerns about, or a plan that there's concerns about, that it's going to be outdated in 5 years? How can we expect that plan to take us 10 years to create? We have to do better, and we must. I think we need some new perspective. I think 14 years of any administration is enough. It's time to turn the page. Experience is important, but experience can also breed myopia. They've had their chance to solve these problems. It's time for a new generation of leadership. We can do better. Thank you.
Mr. Russell?
Again, one of the challenges I face as supervisor that I hope you can appreciate is that we at 1 minute say, well, with the accessory apartments, you move too fast, but with everything else, you languish. Either we're moving too fast or we're languishing. It presents a certain a lack of clarity as to what they expect from us. However, the fact of the matter is the town has been acting. No, we're not sitting around every 2 weeks knitting sweaters. We are actively making changes to the town code on a regular basis, in a lot of instances to preempt future challenges. Do you want a great example? Plum Island. It went up for sale. The town acted quickly. It put zoning in place that would hopefully protect and preserve the island. Now, the zoning itself certainly isn't going to ultimately achieve that. Louise Harrison and some others that are working on a plan, working on a vision, that's what's going to make the difference. The zoning in place was a firewall. And you know what? That's why we don't have a crisis right now of someone proposing building 650 condos there. So we are proactive. We are getting it done, and we're getting it done across a broad spectrum, whether it's the environment, whether it's green energy, whether it's economic development. We're getting those things done. And I can understand the 14 years is too long. It's always the fallback position of a challenger to say to the incumbent, he's been serving too long, or we need term limits. I didn't declare myself czar 14 years ago. I came before you. My first term was 2 years. 4 years, well, I came before you in every election and asked you to show faith and trust in me to carry the leadership, carry this town forward for the next 4 years. And you've showed me that in the past, and I hope you do this November. One other thing I would say is that, people all the time over the years have asked me, well, when are you going to run for higher office? What are you talking about? There is no higher office than a service supervisor of Southold Town. The Assembly, the Senate, Congress, I don't care what office you're talking about. There's no higher honor than serving as supervisor of this town, which is the best town in all of New York State, and I know you all agree with me because you've seen the other towns. What other town can trump this one? I hate to use that word because I pull that back. I pull that back. I pull that back. I pull that back. Don't hold that against me. Don't hold that against me. Ouch. Okay, what other town can Kasich? No, the fact of the matter is there is no town nicer than Southold Town. There is no greater honor. When am I going to run higher? I've already reached the top. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, for both of you.